The Strait Leverage Transfer control is not always about territory. Sometimes it is about transit. That distinction changes everything. Imagine two neighbors locked in a bitter dispute over a fence line. They argue loudly. They threaten lawsuits. The conflict draws attention from the entire street. Cameras arrive, statements are issued, the dispute becomes the story. Now imagine a third neighbor who does not take sides. That neighbor makes no public statements, issues no warnings. Instead, quietly and methodically, that neighbor purchases the only road that leads to both houses. The fence dispute may continue indefinitely, but access to both properties now depends entirely on someone who never entered the argument. Leverage does not require ownership of the contested property. It requires control over the route that sustains it. This is the structural logic behind what can be called the Strait Leverage Transfer. It describes a specific pattern, how influence migrates during moments of crisis stabilization, without any visible change in territorial control, military presence, or formal alliance structure. The transfer is not declared. It is not negotiated. It accumulates. The framework operates in three phases. The first phase is crisis stabilization. Tensions decline. Markets calm. Shipping resumes predictable patterns. Public attention concentrates on the diplomatic outcome. The structural repositioning beneath that outcome goes largely unexamined. The second phase is commercial entrenchment. Long-term contracts expand. Infrastructure investments deepen. Refinery capacity aligns with specific supply sources. Supply chains become progressively more integrated. The primary beneficiary is the actor most capable of absorbing sustained volume during a period of restored stability. The third phase is security dependency. Commercial reliance, sustained over time, creates strategic gravity that is difficult to reverse. Producers grow dependent on stable demand. Importers grow dependent on uninterrupted transit. The actor positioned at the intersection of those flows gains quiet but durable influence over decisions affecting the entire corridor. This framework is testable beyond the Gulf. Apply it to the Strait of Malacca. Apply it to Bab el-Mandeb. Apply it to the Suez Canal. In each case, the question is identical. During periods of restored calm, which actor systematically increases its logistical dependency? In the Gulf today, that question is no longer theoretical. The first shift was diplomatic. The second was commercial. The third was structural. Together, they altered leverage. Move one begins with the most visible fact. The agreement halted immediate escalation between Washington and Tehran. Naval confrontations did not expand. Missile exchanges did not resume. Tanker seizures did not reappear in the headlines. The strait remained open without interruption. From the perspective of crisis management, this was the intended outcome. This diplomatic freeze preserved the existing maritime architecture. Shipping lanes were not redrawn. Patrol zones were not reconfigured. Insurance markets adjusted downward, reflecting reduced short-term risk. Freight operators resumed standard routing. Port congestion in Gulf terminals normalized. From a stability perspective, the objective had been achieved and the mechanism had held. But stability carries a secondary effect that rarely appears in diplomatic assessments. It creates predictable operating conditions. Long-term energy contracts require predictability above almost any other variable. Infrastructure investments demand it. Project financing depends on it. The calm produced by the agreement did not merely prevent conflict, it established a reliable baseline, a window of reduced uncertainty for actors already positioned to capitalize on uninterrupted transit through the world's most consequential energy corridor. That baseline leads directly to Move 2. China remains the largest purchaser of Iranian crude through structured trade channels that operate within or alongside existing sanctions frameworks. This is not speculative. It is observable in customs data, refinery intake patterns, vessel tracking records, and shipping flows documented continuously by maritime intelligence services. services. The volume is significant. The consistency is deliberate. When the strait functions without disruption, Beijing's energy security strengthens in direct proportion. Predictable passage through Hormuz reduces uncertainty across supply chains feeding Chinese refineries along the eastern seaboard. Lower uncertainty reduces strategic vulnerability. It also reduces the cost of maintaining energy reserves because predictable supply allows tighter inventory management without the buffer premiums that volatile corridors demand. Energy security is not abstract. It underwrites industrial production schedules, export competitiveness, and domestic growth targets that carry political weight inside Beijing. A steady, uninterrupted flow through Hormuz reinforces long-term planning horizons. That planning converts commercial reliability into geopolitical resilience, the capacity to absorb external pressure without altering fundamental supply arrangements. As reliance deepens, suppliers adjust their behavior accordingly. Producers calibrate output schedules and pricing structures to match consistent demand from high-volume buyers. That mutual dependence accumulates gradually. It does not require public declarations or formal agreements. It operates through routine transactions repeated across months and years, until the relationship becomes structural rather than transactional. Energy security, compounded across time, evolves into leverage. That leverage then interacts directly with Move 3. The United States Navy maintains a substantial and continuous presence in the Gulf. Carrier strike groups rotate on established schedules. The Fifth Fleet remains fully operational at its Bahrain headquarters. Maritime patrol operations continue. Intelligence sharing with regional partners persists. Officially and visibly, the security architecture of the Gulf did not change as a consequence of the agreement. Yet insurance premiums for commercial vessels transiting the strait declined measurably in the period following the signing. Risk assessments published by major underwriting syndicates reflected reduced probability of immediate armed confrontation. Shipping operators adjusted route costs accordingly. The financial mathematics of Gulf transit improved. Lower premiums translate directly into lower landed costs for energy importers. The reduction is not uniform in its effect. The largest sustained importers, those moving the highest consistent volumes through the corridor, capture the greatest margin benefit from any downward premium adjustment. When volatility declines, high-volume buyers gain cost advantages over competitors whose supply chains depend on less stable or more expensive corridors. The official framing presented the agreement as a diplomatic achievement. That framing may be accurate on its own terms, but the measurable economic consequence was a reduction in the cost of Gulf transit during a period when China was already entrenched as the dominant incremental buyer of Gulf origin energy. The timing did not create that position. It reinforced and extended it. Reduced volatility does not move military flags. It moves balance sheets. Over sufficient time, balance sheets determine strategic options more reliably than forced deployments. Now consider Move 4. Gulf states have increasingly diversified their external partnerships toward Eastern markets. Trade volumes with Asian economies have expanded across multiple sectors. Infrastructure cooperation agreements have multiplied in number and scope. Investment forums and bilateral financial frameworks between Gulf capitals and Beijing have become routine rather than exceptional. This diversification has accelerated over the past several years, and the pace has not slowed. At the same time, these states have not severed their security relationships with Washington. American defense cooperation agreements remain active. Joint military exercises continue on established schedules. Arms acquisition programs persist. The presence is real, and the commitments are honored. This is not a pivot. It is multi-alignment. A deliberate strategy of expanding parallel dependencies rather than substituting one patron for another. Multi-alignment has a specific consequence for leverage distribution. When security architecture remains anchored in Washington, while economic gravity pulls consistently eastward, influence does not concentrate. It distributes. The Gulf does not choose a single dominant partner. It cultivates options. And cultivated options reduce the exclusive leverage any single actor can exercise. That distribution matters precisely inside the strait. Producers that depend heavily on sustained Asian demand will calibrate their policy decisions to protect that demand. Importers that provide guaranteed long-term offtake acquire quiet negotiating weight that does not appear in any formal alliance document, but shapes behavior at the margin nonetheless. From Washington's perspective, naval dominance of the Gulf persists and remains uncontested. From Beijing's perspective, commercial centrality in Gulf energy markets expands steadily and compounds. Both statements are simultaneously accurate. They describe different layers of the same strategic environment, which returns the analysis to its core pattern. The diplomatic freeze preserved transit routes. Commercial entrenchment deepened energy dependency. Insurance recalibration reduced costs for the highest volume importer. Gulf diversification diluted the exclusivity of American leverage across the region. None of these four moves, examined individually, signals a dramatic or irreversible shift. Examined together across the same compressed time frame, they describe a redistribution of structural leverage that unfolds entirely beneath the surface of stabilization, and therefore beneath the threshold of most conventional analysis. That redistribution becomes fully visible only when one confronts the strongest argument against it. The counter-argument deserves serious attention. The Fifth Fleet has not left the Gulf. American sanctions authority remains fully intact. These are not minor details. From this perspective, nothing fundamental has changed in the security architecture of the region. The United States continues to guarantee freedom of navigation through sustained naval deployments that predate this agreement and have not been reduced by it. Carrier strike groups operate within response range. Early warning systems remain active across the theater. Intelligence sharing with Gulf partners persists through established bilateral frameworks. The institutional infrastructure of American maritime dominance is present, funded, and operational. China, by contrast, maintains no permanent military presence in or near the Strait of Hormuz. It does not patrol the corridor. It does not command maritime task forces there. It has no base of operations within the Gulf. Its role is commercial in nature, not security-based. That distinction is not trivial. Sanctions authority also remains a formidable instrument of American statecraft. Washington retains the capacity to restrict financial channels, impose secondary sanctions on third-party actors, and influence the global banking infrastructure that underlies energy trade. That leverage has not been surrendered. It has not been diminished by the terms of the agreement. Under this reading, the deal preserved deterrence while successfully avoiding open conflict. Maritime stability continues to rest on American naval architecture. Commercial flows through Hormuz may benefit China economically, but the security guarantee that makes those flows possible remains a Western construction. That assessment is coherent. It rests on observable military facts that no serious analyst should dismiss. But maritime leverage is not binary. It does not transfer only when fleets withdraw or new bases appear on maps. It evolves through layers that operate on different timescales. Security control is one layer, commercial dependency is another, financial exposure is a third. When these layers move in different directions simultaneously, influence becomes distributed rather than cleanly transferred from one actor to another. An actor does not need a warship in the strait to accumulate leverage. It needs sustained dependency from producers and predictable, low-cost transit for its industrial base. The question is not whether American deterrence collapsed. It did not. The question is whether commercial gravity is gradually reshaping the balance that operates beneath that deterrence. To answer that, the analysis must expand beyond the Gulf itself. Long. Term implications. This is not about a single agreement. It is about the architecture that follows. Energy flows anchor financial systems in ways that are rarely visible during periods of stability. The currency used to price and settle oil transactions reinforces liquidity patterns, reserve holdings, and sovereign debt markets across the global economy. For decades, dollar-denominated oil trade strengthened American financial centrality and provided Washington with structural leverage that extended well beyond military capability. That structure remains dominant. It has not collapsed. It is not under immediate threat. But structures evolve at the margins first. That is precisely where the relevant shifts are occurring. If Beijing secures reliable, low-cost transit through Hormuz over an extended period, its exposure to maritime disruption decreases proportionally. Reduced exposure weakens the coercive leverage embedded in potential supply shocks. the kind of leverage that underpins sanctions effectiveness and financial pressure campaigns. Over time, energy stability can support incremental diversification in payment channels, financing mechanisms, and bilateral settlement arrangements that gradually reduce dependence on dollar-clearing infrastructure. This does not mean the petrodollar system disappears. It means alternatives gain breathing space they did not previously possess. Incremental adjustments in currency use, even modest ones, can accumulate across years into meaningful strategic options. Gulf diversification reinforces this dynamic from a different direction. As Gulf producers deepen commercial ties with Asian economies, logistics corridors linking ports, refineries, and industrial zones become progressively integrated into broader investment frameworks. These corridors connect not only oil shipments, but infrastructure financing, technology transfer arrangements, and long-term investment partnerships that create mutual dependencies extending far beyond energy alone. Maritime choke points then intersect with land-based supply chains in ways that compound strategic significance. Hormuz connects to ports, ports connect to rail, rail connects to industrial clusters. Each additional layer of integration adds resilience to the importing economy and increases the cost of any disruption for all parties. From an Indo-Pacific strategic perspective, reliable Gulf energy underpins China's capacity to project economic influence across the region without sustained vulnerability to supply disruption. That stability interacts with ongoing naval modernization efforts in the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea. It does not replace American military presence. It reduces the strategic vulnerability that such a presence was partly designed to exploit. For Washington, force posture commitments in the region become progressively more complex to justify on pure cost-benefit terms. Sustained naval deployments in the Gulf continue to guarantee transit for all actors. Yet the relative strategic return on those deployments shifts incrementally if commercial gravity moves toward actors less structurally dependent on American financial architecture. This is not a dramatic reversal. No fleet has been expelled. No alliance has dissolved. The shift is incremental, distributed, and largely invisible in real time. Incremental shifts, however, are precisely how long-term power transitions unfold. And if this redistribution is advancing quietly beneath the surface of stabilization, the evidence will not appear in speeches or policy statements. It will surface in measurable, observable signals. Strategic predictions. If leverage has shifted, the evidence will appear in data, not rhetoric. Watch 3 signals. The first signal operates over the next 30 days. Monitor maritime insurance premiums and tanker routing data through the Strait of Hormuz. Major underwriting syndicates publish risk assessments tied directly to regional stability conditions. These assessments adjust within days of significant geopolitical developments. Maritime tracking platforms provide publicly accessible routing patterns that reveal how operators are actually positioning vessels, independent of official statements. If premiums remain suppressed and routing normalizes at higher sustained volumes, stability will be confirmed as durable rather than temporary. If volatility returns within weeks, the leverage transfer narrative weakens considerably. The indicator is clean. Insurance pricing does not respond to diplomatic language. It responds to assessed risk. The second signal operates within 60 days. Examine official announcements of long-term Gulf China energy infrastructure commitments. These may take the form of refinery expansions specifically tailored to Gulf crude grades, strategic storage facility investments in receiving terminals, or new petrochemical joint ventures structured around stable feedstock supply. Such agreements are typically disclosed through corporate regulatory filings, state-owned enterprise announcements, or energy ministry statements. The scale, duration, and financial structure of these commitments matter more than their headlines. Multi-year take-or-pay contracts with capital investment components signal deepening commercial entrenchment. Short-term spot purchase agreements do not carry the same structural weight. The third signal operates within 90 days. Track joint naval exercises, formal port visits, or structured security dialogues involving Gulf states and Chinese naval or Coast Guard forces. These engagements are routinely reported by defense ministries and regional maritime authorities. Even events characterized as symbolic or routine indicate expanding institutional familiarity between security establishments that were previously kept separate from commercial relationships. Sustained absence of such interaction would suggest that commercial integration and defense relationships continue to develop on independent tracks. Each signal is observable without access to classified information. Each can be verified through open source data. If the Strait Leverage Transfer is unfolding as this analysis suggests, these three indicators will begin to align within the timeframes identified. If they diverge or fail to materialize, the thesis requires revision. And that brings us to the question this analysis cannot fully answer. Closing strategic question. What we witnessed was not merely de-escalation, it was recalibration. The question is, who recalibrated more effectively and at whose expense? The agreement lowered immediate war risk. It cooled a volatile corridor that the global economy cannot afford to lose. It preserved regime continuity in Tehran and deterrence credibility in Washington. Those outcomes are tangible. They are real. They matter to the governments that negotiated them and to the markets that priced them in. But control of choke points has never depended solely on naval flags. It depends on dependency. Who relies on the transit most? Who absorbs the largest sustained volume? Who builds the deepest and most durable commercial ties around that flow? Flags can be moved. Dependencies accumulate over years and do not reverse easily. The Strait of Hormuz did not change geography. It changed conditions. Stability created space. Space created opportunity. Opportunity, sustained across sufficient time, converts into structural influence. Did Washington trade short-term volatility for enduring strategic leverage? Or did it stabilize a corridor at the precise moment another actor was optimally positioned to consolidate commercial centrality within it? That question remains unresolved. The answer will not appear in speeches or summit communiques. It will appear in shipping data, infrastructure contract announcements, and quiet security engagements that rarely lead the news cycle. Watch the premiums. Watch the infrastructure deals. Watch the naval calendars. What unfolds in those three indicators will determine whether this moment was containment or the opening of a transition.